We'll have some case studies that are based on work that we've done, and just kind of asking if you've had any similar issues or what you would do in a situation. So feel free to use those as prompts. But if anything else has kind of been a concern for you in regards to privacy with where you're working, as much as you'd love to share, we'd love to hear it and have it be part of the discussion. Here I am. This is me again. So I went to school and started my archival career at Austin, Texas. That's also how I became involved with SSA. My previous job was working within information governance for the state of Texas. And I mention that because I think that work, which was working with not just archival transfers to the state, but also a lot of records retention and aspects of essentially managing all kinds of information for the agency, has really kind of led to the position where I am now at the University of Rhode Island. So my job there, I'm located within the library in the University Archive and Special Collections, and it's first and foremost like a digital archivist position, and I'm there to develop and essentially like manage the digital preservation program, but for the entire university. So I do consult with a lot of departments on campus with issues about electronic records management and data management. The University of Rhode Island is a public land grant institution, about 17,000 students, and with that, about 14,000 are undergraduates. It's on a rural campus. I've been there for less than a year, and it is, when I started and still is, a time of lots of transition. So there's been a lot of leadership changes from the top down. We got a new university president, a new provost, as well as some new positions within the library. My position is actually new, and so it can feel a little bit experimental at times. And I think as a positive, this is an exciting time, as change can be, to be working in considerations for different policies and procedures, which is a big part of my job right now. I would also say that it can make like getting to know the lay of the land and the institutional history sometimes a little bit challenging. So like I said, I'm located in University Archive and Special Collections. There are 3 of us that work there full time, the director and the reference archivist, and then we have 2 part-time student workers. Our collecting strengths are Rhode Island history, the performing arts, and we have a very heavily used textile and pattern archive. So I have this slide here because a big part of my job right now is really assessing where we are right now as far as policies, because I've been asked to do that. So it's really been gathering a lot of requirements from the state and federal, but also within the university. But it's all really like very much like an iterative process, because as I'm like doing that research, I'm also writing the policies and also implementing them. So it's definitely a little bit of an ongoing cycle. And I think that one thing that I try to be careful about is it can sometimes have the potential for an echo chamber, because it's a lot of that is self-evaluation that I'm actually doing on these policies. So this is just some of the legal requirements that as a state-funded university, URI is responsible for. I will point out that we have adopted the General Data Protection Regulation, so from the European Union. And that just means that a big part of my job from the beginning has really been a lot of careful consideration into how we're collecting, sharing and managing donor data, research patron data, and actual research data that's being developed on campus by faculty and students. It's a really critical need on our campus and the most popular thing that I'm asked to consult on. So looking at different privacy perspectives, some of these are also legal requirements, but they're coming from more of like our professional point of view. And there really is a lot of overlap that I try to work through with sort of my professional stance on like wanting to provide a lot of access and also respecting privacy. And it's can be kind of challenging sometimes to know how to make those calls. So we do have some protocols in place for something like, a lot of sensitive and personal information, and how to redact information, what to do with things like Social Security numbers, and student information on our university records. But it gets a little bit more challenging when thinking through thematic content and the collections that we have. So one guideline that I have started to use and I'm very interested in using is a trauma-informed framework. And so this framework establishes principles of action that mitigate the occurrence of a traumatic response and works to kind of reduce any kind of future harm. And this was initially, this framework was developed by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration for healthcare workers. It has since been in use with archivists, other information professionals, and teachers, because I think there's a lot of potential in some of the work that we do, either in the classroom and how we're using materials through education, exhibition and viewing materials, and also providing access and how we're describing the materials. These principles, I think of them as like considerations for awareness, and I think they have the potential for being used internally. I use them as kind of guidelines for internal ways of working and procedures with my colleagues, as well as external policies and communications. But something like safety to me is like a priority, probably like the number one priority. So ensuring a sense of safety for everyone involved. Transparency, just being very transparent and open about how we've acquired materials, how we're intending to use them, how we're describing them, how we're teaching with them. The principles of choice, collaboration. So these are ways to try to level different power imbalances and get more people involved in decision making, certainly incorporating more groups and more perspectives. Culture, history, and gender is certainly a big one to unpack, but it's bringing in things like historical trauma. So we may have in our collections things that depict violence, natural catastrophes, material that was either acquired or can is depicting things that like can be like historically have affected certain groups, slavery, violent colonization, the Holocaust. We have some collection material that is like medical trauma, has really like visual images of like surgeries and amputations. And so just kind of working through having respect for culture and identities and an awareness of it. So I think it's important, for one, to look at the definition that I refer to when I think about trauma. And I'm also going back to the administration's definition of trauma, and just looking at how it can affect people who view the content, and as well as people in communities that are actually depicted in our collections. I do think it's really important to just stress that this is not like a one size fits all, and not everybody will identify with trauma. Not everybody will identify as having experienced trauma, as well as not everybody will have a traumatic response or have a response that is something that you may be familiar with. But I do think it's really important to just kind of see how widespread it can really, like, traumatic like responses could really be. And the idea is in working through developing archival policies and procedures that use this framework, for me, is to use a perspective that at least one person will have like a traumatic response from the material. And I think if you work with that perspective, then you will create policies that are going to be stronger overall. I want to mention too, secondary trauma, sometimes referred to as vicarious trauma. And so this is looking at how trauma can affect us as archival workers. And just being really mindful about ourselves as part of that process. I have a QR code there to a 2016 study that I looked at. And in that study, so 70% of archivists that were interviewed responded that they had worked with traumatic material, that they had a traumatic response either during that work or even a recurring response after that work was completed. And those responses, they can be physical, emotional, or psychological. Some of the most common responses were feelings of detachment, extreme sadness, and about 10% responded that they had some kind of an actual physical illness. So I just think this framework, as well as it helping us to be better custodians of our collection material, I think it can really help us to just check in with ourselves and the way that we're feeling, and maybe being able to have some interventions in that way in doing the work that we're doing, and just caring about also our own well-being and our health when we're looking at the potentially traumatic material. So just a few takeaways as far as I think the importance of using this framework and the impact that it can have is that we can integrate this framework into our organizations by looking to identify traumatic content and also understanding and maybe identifying traumatic responses and how they can either manifest in ourselves as well as other people. Consider policies and procedures that seek to minimize harm. And just overall, this framework advocates for empathy, trust, and awareness of emotional, physical, and physiological responses. So it's really just very much like trying to take like a very holistic view, which is looking at not just the people that are viewing your content, but also the people that could be like depicted in your collection material, and also within yourself and your own response. So just kind of going over back to the current work that I'm doing and some successes and challenges that have kind of come up with implementing this trauma-informed framework in the work that I do. So as I mentioned, it does feel like it's a time to be making changes and implementing new policies and procedures, and taking into account different perspectives when creating like privacy policies and access policies for our collections. I do feel that using this framework has been supported in the work that I'm doing, but I've done some research on it, but I've never, this is very new to me as far as applying it. And it's new to the university as well. And so that just takes time for adjustment. And also sometimes just balancing, honestly, the workload. It can be really tough to, I would say, wanting to take the amount of time that I want to take with collection material. It can be really difficult because there's just so much, of course, there's so much work to do. And so it can be hard, I think, to strike that balance. The archive does have a lot of different, like a really wide variety of format material that we use, and a lot of it is legacy material. So recently we have gotten some new technology. We've gotten some new digital forensics tools, which I think it's very exciting to be able to finally get some of these collections and actually really get to know our collections and make some decisions with. We currently use Google Drive shares as far as sharing material with patrons. Our university IT is about to do a big migration, and so that includes migrating our Google Drive. So we do have to look at another way of providing access. Obviously, a Google Drive is not it's not perfect, and it has, we've run into some technology issues, or I have, like specifically with putting restrictions sometimes on audiovisual file sharing. There is something with Google Drive where I haven't been able to, I think it's just a thing with Drive, but I haven't been able to, like, you can't block downloads of the file if you want to share it with people. And so that brings a lot of privacy concerns. I recently had with a patron wanted some recordings of student performances. And just to say, with policy agreement, with the new leadership transitions, sometimes it can feel like there's a really, like, a strong need to really advocate for what I do. I mean, my position is very new, and it's meant that I do think there's a lot of advocacy work to do, not just for the value of digital archiving and preservation at the university, but also in thinking through some of this policymaking with privacy and access, which really does take, for one, I think, collaboration with some other people in the university. And then it takes time. It takes a lot more time than I think some people realize. So I will pause just to see if anybody has any questions for me.
Okay. Okay, we will keep moving on and save questions for at the end after mine, I guess. So I come from a very different background. So I'm Samantha Shafer. I am the Archivist 2 at the Dickinson Research Center at the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum, which is a mouthful of a name. I have an MLS from UNT, and while I was there, I interned at the National Archives in Fort Worth, which kind of started me on this journey of balancing privacy and access, and especially in today's modern focus on diversity access. So the bottom left photo is actually a slave shipping manifest that is at NARA. And so that was kind of one of the first times that I had to think, like, oh, these are people whose record, whose story they didn't consent to being recorded in this way necessarily. So my work as the Archivist 2 at the DRC is focused on description and access now. And so I have space to do a lot of this policy work. So the DRC was founded in the late 90s, even though the museum itself was founded in 1955. So we provide access to the museum's archival and library collections, which includes institutional archives, special collections, and manuscript archives, and library collection. It's 900 linear feet of shelving, so roughly 3 football fields worth of shelves. So it's a lot I've got to keep track of. You can kind of see some of the boxes on the shelf. And our collecting scope is we're offering context and diverse perspectives to the West's evolving history and cultures. So part of my work as the Archivist 2 has been to migrate legacy finding aids into archive space. And when I started doing that, I realized that a lot of our archival records don't have great provenance records, which I'm sure some of y'all have the same problem. So part of it is that a lot of these archive collections were accessioned before the archives actually existed. So they could be with the registrar and I just don't have copies of them yet. Or it could be something they bought off of eBay and didn't really care about the provenance. Or it could have been accessioned as part of a larger 3-dimensional collection. So again, those records are missing, or we have no idea how it ended up in the vault, and good luck. So this example up on the screen is the John Santangelo image collection, which is a great example of this kind of like very questionable provenance. It is a reference image collection that for some reason was accessioned. It's 90% copy images that were published in True West magazine and sourced from a variety of other archival holdings. So I don't know where this stuff comes from. I don't know what it is half the time. And there's a lot of like really awkward copyright. Like someone's like, I want to use this picture. And I'm like, it's not ours. I'm okay. Like you can look here, here, and here for it, but it's not technically ours. So I can't technically give it to you. And that's just like one tiny problem that I face dealing with these legacy collections. A portion of the materials I work with are also historical ethnographies. And the problem with that is that at the time that these records were created, consent was really not a concern. So you have, for example, we have a collection. It's the Arthur and Shifra Silberman Native American Art Collection. We really like our wordy names. So Arthur and Shifra Silberman ran an art gallery and like kind of a reference library for Native American art. And so they amassed, I mean, it's like 90 plus boxes of records about like the Kiowa Six and other Native American artists. And I have just anecdotal evidence. I don't have any provenance records that either like agree or disagree with it, but that one of the artist's diaries that is collected in that, they literally just like picked up off the floor of her apartment after she died. And they may or may not have had the right to do that. And like, did she even want that stuff to be preserved for forever? I don't know. And so it's kind of like like a gray kind of ew area of like, do we have the right to share this? But like the book has been published before I was even born. So I don't know. But those are the kind of things I have to consider when working with these collections. So as I've been working with getting these legacy findings up and accessioning new collections, I try to keep in mind privacy and access. And I've broken privacy down into kind of three subcategories: personal, cultural, and institutional privacy. So these are the things that I'm trying to address. So personal privacy, pretty obvious, is privacy towards an individual represented in collection materials. It could be the person themselves requesting privacy, or it could be family or their descendants. A very obvious example of this is oral histories. So the museum houses oral histories that are collected by the Rodeo Historical Society of various rodeo performers. And we have a release form. It's on the left on the slide that has space to say any sort of release requirements they have of who can access this, when it can be accessed, whatnot. Now, as with most people, they don't always read the form and they're like, yeah, sure, whatever, sign it. So it is, again, I'm trying to be better about you do consent, like verbally asking as well as having them sign to make sure they understand. In my time, I've been at the museum 4 years. In my time, nobody has ever put any restrictions, but we at least have the space for that to happen. But oral histories are not the only example of personal privacy that can be an issue. I don't know if anyone remembers, there was a case out of Harvard in 2017 where they found daguerreotypes of enslaved persons in Harvard's anthropology department. And so they made them publicly accessible and usable. And the descendants of the persons in those images actually sued Harvard for the right to use those images. And that, I mean, it points out a very, very interesting, like ethically gray area, because copyright law states that the photographer owns the copyright of the photo. So if the photographer signs the photo over to your archive, you now have legal copyright and you can do whatever you want with it. However, what if the subject of the photograph didn't consent to being photographed? Because that's what's happening in this case. Enslaved persons obviously didn't consent, and the descendants sued Harvard for the right to remove them from public access. And I think this quote is a great example of that kind of like, how do we balance that? Because as archivists, we're all about access, but at the same time, I don't want to traumatize someone or like cause any harm to someone who might be represented in the collections. So it's very, very gray area. So we have a similar collection, unfortunately, in our in the DRC. It's maybe not quite as extreme, but we do have the Arthur M. Tinker photographs. So Tinker was a Bureau of Indian Affairs agent who traveled around the West visiting various agency outposts, and he was an amateur photographer, so he photographed the people he met with. Again, did these people consent to being photographed? I don't know. And unfortunately, I don't know how to know. A lot of times Tinker didn't identify people in these photographs beyond maybe their tribal affiliation or where he was when he took the photograph. So in an ideal world where I have 700 hours in the day, I could, go through census records and Bureau of Indian Affairs agency records and all these things to try and match up these people. But even then, that's not a guarantee I'm going to find them and then be able to find their descendants and say like, hey, is it cool that your great-great-great-grandmother's photograph is, being used for whatever people want to use it for? And again, ideal world, I could do that work. Unfortunately, I am one person working the work of 4 people like we all are, and I don't always have time to do that as much as I would like to. So that kind of segues into the next type of privacy, which is cultural privacy. So obviously Indigenous subject. And then this is a finding aid for another Indigenous subject. And it kind of brings up the point of, do we have the right to make these available to anybody and everybody? So for this, I'm defining cultural privacy as information that should not or maybe should not be accessible to someone who is not a member of that culture. So in this case, if it's like a tribal practice that maybe someone not a member of the tribe should have access to or have an understanding of. So I minored in anthropology back in the day. And so I know that there are various levels that was discussed in my anthropology class of cultures inviting people in to witness things, but not always. So again, for this collection, there is a written explanation of a green corn dance. Should that be available to everybody? Based on the surface level research I've done, it's not specifically an issue, but again, I'm not Indigenous. I cannot be the person to make that final call. Like Jenny said, when you're the only person in your archive, and it kind of becomes an echo chamber when you're making those decisions. So we really have to outsource and have these conversations about what can we do with these materials. So the final type of privacy issues I run into is institutional privacy. So in this is information that, should it be made publicly accessible, will compromise the safety or the integrity of the institution itself or the collections. So for me, a lot of that is architectural records. I've had several architectural companies who are doing renovation work at the museum request to see old architectural records. And so I have to be careful about what I can share that might reveal how to access the vault. Another good example is accession records. We have a legal team doing digital rights research right now, and we have to scan the accession records for identifying information for donors who wish to remain anonymous before we can share it with the digital rights team. So only either myself in the archives or the registrar in 3D collections know who those donors are to maintain their privacy. So those are our 3 types of privacy. So for the DRC, I'm working to kind of create policies on how to handle these situations. So I've broken it down into 3 phases. I'm in phase 1 right now, which is the research phase. So I am having conversations with the registrar to see what existing policies are on that side of the collections. I'm meeting with museum legal counsel to discuss what are my legal boundaries around this? What do I have to do? And what is not as clearly defined, and reviewing a lot of scholarship around both legal and ethical bounds of privacy. So once I finally get through the research, I'll move on to phase 2. Which is outreach. I will review policies from other museums and archives. So if you're doing this work, feel free to get in touch. I'd love to know what you're doing. I'm also going to review sample documentation from AAM, SAA, any sort of organization that does this work, and ideally speak with tribal nations and other cultural entities about their preference. What is their ideal situation when working with sensitive materials? And then finally, you get to write everything. put it all down, document it all. So ideally, I'd like to create a guide for donors explaining their privacy rights when they're donating materials, and a guide for future archivists on how to handle these legacy collections when it isn't documented, and then what to do if the access is contested, like how to navigate that without, I don't know, making it worse. So that is my work in a summary. We're going to pause for questions here, and then we have case studies. So as kind of like a group discussion. So if you'd rather wait for that and throw in some thoughts, you can, but if not, speak, be heard. Anybody? Open the chat, see if anybody's going. Yeah.
You mentioned images, and I know like more contemporary photographers will take images of buildings or streets, and there's a lot of people in these images. How do you handle privacy concerns with that? Or you have whole communities.
I mean, for me, I think my first thing would be like, is anyone obviously identifiable? Because some of those, if it's say like a street shot from across the street and people are walking this direction and the photographer is shooting from the side, you may not be able to identify everyone. So it's a little bit safer, I think, for your subjects. But even then, it's like, I would talk to the photographer. Where did you take this? Did you ask any of these people? Do you have any sort of like release records that could be shared with us as the holding institution? I don't know what. Thanks.
And I'll just repeat the question just for anybody at Zoom. So the question was, so with photography and that are capturing images where there's a big group of people, and how do you handle privacy concerns when you have a big group of people, some of whom are not identified or maybe cannot be identified? I think I know every institution that I've worked at has had images like that in our collections. And so what Samantha says is definitely, I think, a big part of that is doing what you can to identify as much information about the people, the time and place, the photographer, and seeing what you can document. And to go back to sort of the principles and using the trauma-informed framework, there's something, and it's hard for me to put into words because I think it's almost like it's listening to like your professional instincts as well as, I think, in a way, like your personal, like your feelings. And so if you feel like something doesn't feel right about it, I would, if you can, maybe ask yourself why and start having some conversations, like Samantha said, with some other people, and get as close to the community that's depicted as you can and ask them about it, or anybody that's connected to a time in that place in history, and then be transparent about it. If you're going to show the image, if you've made that decision after thinking through it and the information that you have about it, try to put something in the description about, and just even to say, we have entire communities depicted here. Some of this might be violent, some of it may not be. We couldn't get the consent, but here's why we've chosen to show this image. And also, I think keeping a door open for communication. Yeah, external communication.
I was about to say that.
I think that it can be a really, I think that's a really great thing to implement as far as your institutional policies, if you can. Actually, the Albuquerque Museum is one model that I look at, because they do have, with some of their digital images, you can't actually view the image online, but they do have a placeholder with some metadata, and then they have a contact email. And so if you feel like something you don't think, you have something to say about that image or that collection, if you feel like things should be taken down, you have an immediate contact there. And I think that can be another way. I don't know if you want to add to that.
No, I was going to say is the moment somebody would contact me in this situation about an image, I would take it down and say, have, again, public transparency on whatever your public access point is, that like this image is under review for, privacy and maybe even copyright issues. If you're interested in viewing this item, please contact the archive and we'll discuss if that's an option even. So that way people know why it's being taken down from public accessibility. We did have someone in the chat who contributed to this. So Matthew, thank you. They said, from my past employer while I was there, Crow Indian photographs now online. They had issues because of the purchase nature of the collection and the history of the Montana government to work with the Crow Nation in identifications. So staff came up with an internal informal policy about how to describe the images consciously, and then put a link in the newsletter, which I will definitely be saving for myself later. And I think that's like, you can only work with what you know. And the moment somebody says you're wrong, you have to say, okay, how can I do better? Which I think is the core of this work is to not have the like, oh no, just again, I'm here to listen. So any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
More of a comment or an illustration. We get continuous pushback on our privacy policy for our branch Davidian collections. We have about 15 branch Davidian collections, and a lot of them are recordings, FBI recordings. The FBI transcripts and things to the negotiations are online on the FBI website. You can access them there, but there are a lot of recordings that come from within the compound. And there are people's voices in there on those recordings that have no idea they were recorded. So we choose not to distribute that content. Now, if you want to come to the Texas collection and listen to it, you're welcome to, but you can't copy it and you can't download it. And we get a lot of pushback on that. But luckily, Baylor's general counsel has supported our decision and went ahead and put it in writing, so that, we can say, no, I'm sorry, you're welcome to come here, but we're not going to let you take this content out.
Okay, I'm going to recap for our people on virtual. So you have Branch Davidian recordings from the FBI. Anything that the FBI did in interrogations, I'm assuming, is publicly available, but anything that features Branch Davidian members that did not know they were being recorded is not available, or not like via digital share. It can only be accessed on site. And your legal counsel at Baylor, I'm assuming, at Baylor has actually released a statement to support this choice. And so you have that policy in writing for researchers, which I think is super, super useful. So anybody else? Yes.
Get like administrative buy-in to explore it if you like work somewhere that historically thought about it.
Okay, so that's a good question. How do you get administrative buy-in, especially for places who maybe don't document their policies? So I've kind of been of the ask forgiveness, not permission school, where instead of saying, can I write this? I say, I have written this document that I would like the curatorial department and the collections department to review. Here's some context for it. Because I'm in the same boat. A lot of our policies have not been documented, or if they were documented in 1998 and never updated. So for me, it's making sure that I'm not the only person writing it, because again, I'm just one person. I don't have all the perspectives. It doesn't need to be an echo chamber. And having my colleagues review it, and hopefully, ideally, our legal counsel to review it as well. And I know you're doing that work.
Yes, I do. I do a lot of that work. I think, so to kind of go off what Samantha was saying, I think as far as the, kind of just kind of try to roll ad hoc with the policy if you can. That's not always possible. But for instance, with patron requests or sometimes like faculty that will email me questions has been a place for me to start to kind of like test out some of the privacy policies. And it's so far been well received. And so now there's a little bit of a history now that I have with, these policies are being well received in the university community, the patrons that we're serving, the faculty members that we're serving. There hasn't been, pushback yet. But also I haven't done a lot of outreach yet. So it's a very like small pool so far. URI, like a lot of places, or in my experience, can be very data driven, and that's not always a world that I want to be in, but I do think that it has led to a lot of success as far as communicating with administration. So if you can get numbers that tell a story, if you can get numbers that work in your favor, or more to the point, if you can get numbers that work to the university, your institution's favor, and from their side of the street, and things that are important to them without like compromising the work that you're doing, of course. But, for me, it's like knowing what the university's like new strategic mission is, which they're just rolled out this year. And showing how, like, with that, some of these policies that I'm writing help to support that. And numbers really help. So, with privacy, if you can cite things for the New York Times, any kind of like national or international headlines where there's been like some sort of breach, privacy breach, confidentiality concerns, look what happened here. Here's how I'm mitigating risk. Things like that can be, I think, really helpful tools. And then internally, if you can pull data from, for instance, if you're kind of able to roll out some policies ad hoc and get some kind of feedback from anybody that you're working with, or, just kind of show that there's like a value for it, like in my case, we've got a lot of questions about data management, so much actually, more than I expected to, and right from when I started. So if you can kind of demonstrate that and just say, hey, this is a critical need, you hopefully there'll be a little bit more in your camp. No, there was another share though for just with the Zoom chat for the Crow Community College Archival Collection description of photocopies of images. So thank you so much for sharing resources. That's really helpful. I look all the time at related policies that are some institutions have posted online. It's very, very helpful in the work that I do. So thank you for sharing. For case studies. Sure. Yeah. So we did just kind of have a couple of prompts just to kind of see kind of what maybe y'all would do in a similar situation. So these are kind of pulled from our own work essentially, but they're a little bit theoretical in terms of that. Sometimes they're kind of a combination of different projects that we've worked on. But to go off the categories that Samantha talked about, and so personal privacy again, so we're talking about an individual represented in the collection materials, and also expanding that out, that it could be their descendants as well, and protecting that privacy. So kind of a consideration for oral histories that might have information about migrant, and under consideration to be made available to public research. So I've experienced this with a few institutions, and sometimes it's student information. And so how much of that would we make publicly accessible? Currently where I am, it's completely restricted. It's restricted to only a few people within the archive, because we do have we have questions about how the information was collected. I have some concerns, I would say, about some outdated language, which is true, I think, in many collections where the way that material was described or in interviews with these oral histories, some of the language that's being used is outdated. It's really not, I think, appropriate to how people identify themselves or how we hopefully we would choose to talk about different cultures or identities. So I have some concerns about that. It's really an area that I'm not sure what to do with, other than adding in like a statement on language, statement on outdated language, which I've seen some institutions do. At another institution that I worked at, we did get actually go and get written permission from everybody in the collection. And I think that's really essential. If you can do it, it's essential to try to do that and obtain that permission before you make it accessible. But that's on a much bigger scale than I would say some institutions maybe have the resources for. So that is also a consideration. So I don't know if anybody else has had any kind of similar question marks, especially with, I have found so far with the audiovisual collections, it feels a little bit more tenuous. It just feels, like I said, we don't have, so like we don't have a designated like reading room space where you could, listen to or view certain files that so we have to, if we're going to make them accessible right now, we are making them accessible via Google Drive. And so it with those files in particular, it definitely feels a little bit risky. And I have more concerns over that because I'm not able to put in some of those same restrictions on downloads and time limits and what people do with those files after and how they could manipulate those files as I can with a lot of text documents and things like that. Yes.
We passed the microphone.
Oh yeah, here, I'll walk with it.
Thank you. I just had a volunteer going through a collection, and not only did he find Social Security numbers just everywhere, there were also medical records, particularly about mental health treatment that had happened. And so suddenly I was like, oh, okay, well, let me get a Sharpie and we'll start working on those Social Security numbers. But the mental health treatment, and it was serious. I don't quite know what to do with that. It seems part of this person's story, but what has anybody else done? Has anybody else run into this? Yep. Oh, everybody has.
We're processing collection right now from a woman who was very candid about her mental health situation. So kind of the dividing line is like if it's real medical, and she's deceased, but we are in touch with her son. But if it's a real medical record, we restrict it. But if it's just her talking about how she hates taking her medicines, she hates these doctors, then, we go ahead because she was herself very open about it.
And I probably have a little different perspective because I actually work for a medical university. And so we get a lot of stuff with, treatment from professors and such. And we actually, we lock it down. We restrict it just for, it's strong HIPAA concerns. And, HIPAA is in effect 70 years after their death date. So, if that's the case with you and you can, he's been deceased that long, then you can obviously open up about it and you're not, going against any HIPAA laws or anything like that. But that's something that we fully restrict it. We do get a lot of stuff with like student numbers and social security numbers and stuff. Obviously, those are all covered under privacy laws, FERPA as well, and those are restricted as well. We don't actually get the medical records, thankfully, but sometimes, they make their way to us. So I would just check and see like under HIPAA and those laws, but I would suggest just restricting it until the time of, if you know his death or if you know his birth date and, maybe at the time he might have lived to be like 80. I always kind of be like, oh, they had a long, healthy life, 80 or 90, and then do the math from there.
So our case at the University of Alabama is a little different. We're not just a medical library, obviously, or special collections, but we have Bryce Hospital that's on campus, and it was a very big mental health facility, but specifically for Black African Americans. And there were a lot of students there as well. So even though our university started in 1831 and that hospital was running until then, so HIPAA doesn't really affect us, we still keep those under lock just because they are very sensitive and also very racist documents about their medical health. So we just do that for the public, but we do have a small collection. It's only like 2 linear feet. And it was a diary of someone that stayed there, and they were very open, like your person is, about it and how it, was part of their journey. And they were documenting what was happening in the hospitals when no one else was. And we do keep that one open, but you're not allowed to take photos of it like our other documents, and you can only come in person to see them. So that medical record is available just because it was part of their story, like yours, and HIPAA doesn't affect it. But other collections that HIPAA doesn't quite affect, we're still like, no, we're not going to do that. So that's just food for thought if you have a bigger collection.
I think it's really cool to see how many people are dealing with this very issue. So our institution, where I specifically kind of representing our institution, I'm working with a team to preserve the Texas state hospitals as a whole. And one of the things that we talk about, as a committee, because there's only a staff of 1 to do this whole job as of yet, which is like 1 staff member. It's great paid position. Is talking about, of course, state hospital records for patients are, fall under HIPAA, and Texas has more restrictive HIPAA laws when it comes to accessing patient records. You have to be lineal descendant, which frustrates researchers because they'll call and say, well, my great aunt was in this mental institution 50 or so years ago, and my daughter is mentally ill, because customers will tell you what's up, right? Like, I know I've heard a lot of stories, and that's where we talk about that tension between, what can be done by law and what falls out of that area, that gray area, especially when it comes to these records that, we're not oftentimes consensually made, right? But then the other half of the coin is from not just like a purely research perspective, but also like if this history touches you, what we do have available are reports, studies, things from admin, nothing about patient lives. And so it's always a case-by-case basis. And until kind of the first thing that's been happening is there's a small exhibit at the Bullock Museum, if you're in Austin, that's rotating about Austin State Hospital. And we can show like pages, like ledgers from the 19th century with patient information, but all the names are redacted so that you're not, you're seeing like, oh, these are lives that are being accounted for. You're seeing the nuances or to the best of your ability, but you can't tie them to specific people. That was long-winded, but bigger conversation.
So awkward holding the thing. So I just wanted to share a similar experience of finding, so it was actually a judge's papers, and he was very involved in establishing like I don't even remember exactly what it's called, a court appointed special advocate program in Arkansas. So he had a lot of information about these individual minors that needed court appointed special advocates. And the information about them is interesting and helpful historically to understand the context in which this was created, and restricting all of them would take a large piece of his experience as a judge away from the collection. So we ended up redacting just all of the personal information about the people and keeping sort of the testimony information. So anything that could identify them, like age, race, all of that was redacted. We do have the originals, though, obviously kept somewhere so that maybe one day they could all be accessible. But yeah.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt for a second to check time in the chat. Let me get back up to the front. So do we have anything good in the chat? Okay.
Yeah. So we do have some participation from the chat. Paul just points out that under HIPAA, medical records are open 50 years after death. So thank you for that. And there's a question from Billy. Do you let families see sensitive information and just restrict the public? I work for a tribe, so we would know if it is family. Is that just up to us? I do not have an answer for that. So that would be a conversation or to open up to the group. There is a response from Matthew that also on chat. Ohio statute on confidentiality of mental health records. He says, like the other speaker, we could only make records available to direct descendants with proof of legal connection at my Ohio County Record Center. And then there's a link there as well. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm just curious. Has anybody experienced that where can you let families have that sense that access?
So we actually have two cases for like actual like medical records and stuff. Those go through the medical record department. As the university archive, we don't have that. But we do have, in particular, we have patient ledgers from 1900 to 1948 from one of the hospitals that has been since been decommissioned and torn down and stuff. And we actually had recently, like within the last month, had a big conversation with legal, and we are not allowed to even look like tell them any information that are in those, you know, whether they, we've gotten questions like, oh, we were adopted. I was adopted from this. Can you know, find me in the ledgers or something? And we are not allowed to do that at all.
Okay, well, that was an excellent discussion. I'm really glad everyone participated. We actually had two other case studies, but I don't think we have time. So thank you all for coming. Yeah.